Good afternoon. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with Anita Mir about her new book, which is titled The Inside City. Anita wears many hats. She is an academic who is currently working on the intersectionality between Islam and Christianity. And her next book will be focusing on Pakistan's Christians and combines both her activism, journalism, and her academic work. Prior to entering academia, she worked as a journalist in Lahore, where she was features editor at the Frontier Post. So The Inside City is a story about Lahore's walled city in the years leading up to partition and in the years during and after that. In your own words, I think it would be good to start off with you talking about, as an author, what this book is about.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yeah.
So this is a book which is set in a fixed time in a world or the world of men at least, are becoming increasingly passionate about politics and passionate about what they see as the future. And that future entails first India and then moving on to, as the climate changes, about Pakistan. And my protagonist is called Aves, and thank you, Jim. My protagonist is called Aves, and he rejects this idea of politics. He rejects his interest in politics, and until the moment when he's actually forced to realize how important politics has become.
So the city of Lahore is in many ways one of the main characters in this novel. Why the walled city as a backdrop?
My mother grew up in the walled city, and I've always been fascinated by its buildings, its gates, and as far as I know that there are walled cities throughout the world, and Lahore, I think, is one of the only few, or perhaps the only one, which has 13 gates. So I was just wondering, what would it be if, 13? 13 bhi galat hai na? 13. Though I just wondered what would happen if someone had discovered the 13th gate and they thought it brought bad luck into the city, and so they lock it and they bar it, and then my protagonist finds it. And so I thought that part would be interesting as a story aspect, but it was also about the whole idea of the British were mapping. When the British Empire, they were mapping the whole of all the continents, all the countries that they were ruling, and they thought to map a world was to have knowledge of it and to own it in a way. And the one place that they couldn't map was the inside city. They thought it was too messy, it was too all over the place, and I thought, well, that would be interesting that they can't map it, and my protagonist begins to map it, but he's mapping it for his own reasons, and then his reasons for mapping it change.
So I think now we should have Anita read out an excerpt from the beginning of the book to kind of highlight how this imagery plays out.
Okay, so I'll just read a little bit. It begins with, this is like the prologue, and then I'll just read a page or two. Deep within a city, a crow and a pigeon conversed. No, that's not true. The crow talked, and the pigeon pretended from time to time to listen. Secrets, said the crow, finally clocking onto the fact that the pigeon's attention was lax. Great secrets, the least you could do. The pigeon yawned. He'd seen people do it all the time and had been at great pains to learn this newest of skills, wondering what reaction it'd kindle. The crow whispered, so rude, but because above everything else it was an audience he yearned for, he ignored the pigeon's effrontery and went on. I can tell you, said the crow. Can you tell me, said the pigeon, where to get some bread? The crow sadly shook his head. The pigeon, his pity growing, said, tell me what you are going to say. You don't want to hear. But, said the pigeon, I do. The crow rustled in slow-burning pride and said, I can tell you how secrets are broken and how they are made. The crow waited. In his head, he could already hear the applause. Is that all? Laughed the pigeon. The crow didn't reply. He shed a feather, black ink dry, because crows have learnt not to cry. What's the point? Even ugly-looking animals are loved by someone, but crows are too strong a reminder of what no one wants to be reminded of, and so are spurned. Down, down the feather swirled, into the depths of the walled city, the inside city of Lahore. So it begins in March 1928, in the inside city, which was part of India then. Despite the fact, and the story is about the Dar family. Despite the fact that their three-storied house had so many rooms, as a family, the Dars lived, like almost everyone else they knew, in the rooftop courtyard, summer and winter, day and night. Adjoining the courtyard was the narrow kitchen with its mesh door. In its top left-hand corner, a gaping hole through which flies and mosquitoes smothered in and out all summer long, and the corridor that led to the family bedrooms and to the stairs down to the other rooms, the round room, the best room, the guest room, and rooms which had become a dumping ground in which no one ever really entered now. The stairs also led to the front door. Early on this Sunday morning, the whole family, except Dar Saab, was at home. At his mother's bidding, Awais moved the charpai into the sun. She sat down again. Pulling her feet up, she sighed, content. His sisters, Batul and Tanveer, flitted in and out of the courtyard, their heads together as close as twins. Batul picked up little Mariam, who'd been lying beside him. Just him and his mother now. Tanveer called to their mother. Slowly she got up. Awais bent his head, waited. When he was sure she was gone, he skidded down the worn brick stairs, stood on his toes to open the latch of the front door. There he was, away from her eyes, outside on the streets. He looked back up at the house. His father had told him the story of how, when he'd got married, he'd had the brick front painted white, which many people had quietly said was showy, and not so quietly said was a waste of money and time. What paint there was left was now yellow, like paper which tea had spoilt. And then it goes on to a little description, I'll just cut short. So he's out of the house, he runs out of the house, and click, click. He looked up, smiling, expecting Raj, which is his neighbor, to have reappeared. Awais's gaze ran across all the shutters of Raj's house, then turned to his own. The kitchen shutter was open. His mother, he's always feeling that his mother is observing him and watching him. He stood there, adamant, growing surly. The kitchen shutter rattled to the slow rising breeze. He peered harder but couldn't see her. He began to run through the narrow streets, swerving past the vegetable and fruit carts, the languorous movement of people for whom time was indefinite. He began to cough, the sound of metal scraping on stone. He couldn't stop. No, he thought, not again. He bent double and waited till it was over, his body harrowed and hurting. He straightened. Awais was tall. He looked more 11 than 8. Ahead of him, the road was blocked. 2 Englishmen, dressed in civilian clothes, so not officials, were surrounded by an array of strange devices. A rod holding up what looked like a giant protractor, a measuring tape, and most interestingly for Awais, a tripod on which was fixed some kind of telescope. The men were taking it in turns to look through the telescope contraption and observe something. Awais so wished he could see through their machine. Maybe if he asked, he felt his face flush. He knew he never would. They were English, and he'd never spoken to an Englishman in his life. The younger of the 2 men, as tall, thought Awais as 2 men put together, picked up the measuring tape and, bending down, began measuring the road. After a little while, he returned to the man who was clearly in charge and said something. Awais caught only a stray word or two. The older man, with his thick ginger moustache and short beard that had gone awry, opened his notebook and began to write. The other man respectfully stepped back, waited. Looking up, he spied Awais. Through pointy teeth, the sound of a whistle. The older man looked up, frowned. "That boy's watching us," said the younger. The older man turned to Awais, stared. "What if," continued the younger. The older man cut him off. "To them, it's all gobbledygook. Indians don't have a scientific bone in their bodies. Now be quiet while I finish this." And with that, his head bent back to his notebook. The younger man turned his back petulantly on Awais. Leaning against a closed shop shutter, not too far away, someone else was watching the English officials. Awais was now convinced that's what they were. In his hand, the man clasped a long stick of sugar cane, which he bit into when he remembered, hardly chewing, spitting the debris out like a small mat of hay. When Awais approached, the man looked at him with blood-veined, sleepy eyes. "Bhai Saab," said Awais. The man tugged at his lungi, tucking a loosened end of the cloth back at his waist. He then pulled himself up to honor the address. "Do you know what they're doing?" "Mapping," said the man. He held out his hand, offering Awais a bite of his sugar cane. Awais shook his head. He turned again to look at the 2 Englishmen. The younger was crouching, searching in his bag for something, his face full of confusion. Awais turned to the sugarcane man. "Why?" he asked. The man bit his sugarcane, chewed, then spat to his other side. "Why?" asked Awais again, thinking he hadn't been heard. The man laughed, a braying sound. "They're English," he said. The two Englishmen picked up their equipment to move on. What are they mapping, Avers thought, and why?
Thank you so much. So I want to move on to talking about the representation of gender within the novel. I find it very interesting that one of your central characters in the novel, that of the mother, Khurshid, is someone who almost represents a trope, that of the doting South Asian mother who places all of her hopes and aspirations solely in her son, but that ultimately it's the character of the daughter, Maryam, who turns out to be almost a foil to these traditional ideas. So how does that play out in the novel, and how do the male characters react to it?
So I took the idea of a woman who, as you say, is a trope, who a typical sort of South Asian or Pakistani woman who who belongs to a particular time in which women didn't have the ability or weren't allowed to dream big or think for themselves or think of a life for themselves. And so she puts all her aspirations on her son, her soon-to-be-born son. And she thinks that he is going to fulfill the life that she hasn't lived in some way. And that's a belief system. That's just a belief or a dream that she has. And then what happens is that a seer or a peer comes and actually tells her that what she believes is true, but on a much grander scale, that Avers is going to do absolutely great things. And so she gets this confirmation that it's going to be even bigger than she thought. But then I thought, what if I take the idea of what the peer has said, and instead of it being the peer is right about the house, but what if he is wrong about the person for whom this greatness is destined for? So instead of a verse, I thought, what would happen to the family dynamic if it's actually the younger sister who is predestined to do great things? And then I thought what would make it even more difficult for a verse is that if Maryam, his younger sister, is the one that he loves most in the family. And so what would happen to that sort of dynamic? And so the mother, when she realizes this, begins to hate her daughter because she feels that she's stolen her son's gift. And then she tries to teach Avers her hate. And he's always trying to resist it because he loves his sister so much. So I played with a trope and wanted to just explore how to change it, how to make it somehow bigger in that way.
Absolutely, and I think it's a very interesting interplay. And I think at this point now, we're going to be showing a short promotional video about the book.
Hanji.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that before I put it on, this is a short video that was made by 3 friends of mine. It was made by Zaman Hazar, and another friend, Mikal Hassan, gave us a song, and one of my friends is a great Shakespearean actor. I write plays, so I've worked with him, and he did the voiceover. So we did it on a shoestring budget.
Why? A prediction of greatness. A prediction that goes wrong. A beloved sister with a genius for maths. A family torn apart. A secret found. Partition. The greatest migration of people the world has ever known. Who do you save? Who can you save?
I think that demonstrates quite beautifully the multitudes of layers that are within the novel. And I think...
Can I just say something? I was trying to get at, I hope, it was that I wanted to try and do the contradictions that would be between the mother and the father, Aves's mother and father. So Aves's father is more modern thinking. He's the one who believes in that the future is changing, it's changing for the better, and the politics, and the mother falls into the group of believing in a more traditional sort of role. And I wanted to show that because we're entering the modern period, not just the modern period in the world, but especially for Pakistan and India. So it's the crux of these two things are pulling at each other while we develop and we learn which way we're going, not just politically, but culturally as well. And I wanted to do the dynamic between the past and the present in the sense that, as I said, Aves rejects the idea of a future, he rejects the idea of modernity, and he rejects the idea of the politics until he's forced to look at it closely. But I wanted it to be that his interest is in the older city, so he is interested in the walled city, he's interested in the aesthetics, the architecture of how beautiful this city is, and then it becomes important for another reason. And his sister is interested in something which I thought would be traditionally more male, which would be maths, because they tend to think that women are not good at maths, and it's more of a rational thing. So whereas he's more interested in the aesthetic, and she's more interested in the rational world. So I wanted those two dynamics to pull at each other and explore that as well. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I think another strand within the novel is that from the very beginning, the father in the novel, Mr. Dar, represents a growing political consciousness within Indians in the years leading up to the partition of 1947. In what ways did you use the character of Mr. Dar to demonstrate how this sense of nationhood and this discourse of assertion and autonomy transformed and evolved over time?
Well, I wanted Dar Saab. So Dar Saab is always tuned into the news. He's always listening to the radio. He's always following what's happening in the world, what's happening in the politics of India, but also on the larger global level. And he gets his information from different sources. He's a modern thinking man. He's against this whole idea of the prediction. He's against the superstition. And so he's pushing against that force of his wife, but also pushing against this idea of a locked past. And so he grows and he becomes very sort of embroiled in the whole Free India movement, and then I have him develop, as some people did, then he becomes a follower of Jinnah, and then what happens when he realizes that this idea of a Muslim nationhood has something to it as well. But because we were talking to Noorzadeh before, and I was saying that sometimes when you live in a particular time, like say, when you're living in a time, like you might be living in the time of Musharraf, you might be living in the time of Imran Khan, all of the times that you're living in, we live in those times and we analyze those times. But I think sometimes because it's so much, and Pakistani politics and Indian politics has been so much, so heavy in our consciousness, that I wanted him also to be a little bit confused about understanding exactly what has happened. So he's not someone who has a linear sort of knowledge. I go from being political to understanding a Free India movement to understanding what Pakistan means. I wanted him to have a little bit of confusion with him as well while he's taking this journey.
So what really stood out for me, when I was reading the book, was how it weaves together so seamlessly and so intricately the personal and the political. So it's about the very personal narrative of a family, but that coalesces and converges with the overarching socio-political landscape very, very seamlessly, and it's never completely submerged by it. So my question is, how did you go about balancing the personal and the political?
Thank you. I don't know whether I have, but I wanted to keep the political as the background because it's not a treatise, it's not a theoretical idea. I wanted it to be about family, I wanted it to be about people, but I wanted it to deliberately set it in this particular time. I know like partition novels are difficult in that way because there have been such great ones, not just obviously Manto, but Amrita Pritam and Udas Nasle. So I know that there's been great work there which already exists. But this is my love letter to Lahore, and I wanted it to be about Lahore, set in Lahore, and I wanted to get away from the narratives that I've often heard of sort of fundamental Islam. I didn't want to do a fundamental Islam story about bombs and all of that kind of thing, and I wanted to set in this period. So my story actually, Aves's birth takes place in 1917, in the same year that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. So I wanted the idea of something great, fortuitous, happening at the same time as something really horrible and evil happens as well. And I wanted to keep that play of the politics in the background. So as I said, Aves keeps on rejecting the politics, but you cannot reject, as we all know, as Pakistanis, most of us, is that you cannot reject the political time in which you exist. It does come and get you at the end somehow. So he when he finds out, he's just exploring the city for one reason, and then it becomes important for another reason, and that happens in partition, but I don't want to tell you exactly what happens there. But yes, so that is when sort of politics just comes knocking at his door, and that he realizes what he's got to do, but he also realizes the mistakes he's made by being apolitical, by thinking that people are just political. When you're talking about a colonizing force, as the British were, it's difficult to just see people as people. So I've tried to look at those elements. Yeah.
So there are some threads which are left ambiguous in the novel. Could you explain why this is?
So I deliberately left some threads ambiguous. As I said, I'm a playwright, and I like the idea of drama. That's why it's set as a novel rather than a historical narrative. I wanted it to be dramatic. I hope it's dramatic. I don't know if it is. But I left things deliberately ambiguous. One or two threads deliberately ambiguous. Like why would Khurshid hate her daughter so much? One of the two of those things. Because I wanted my readers to bring their own imagination to it as well. I wanted them to be able to color in the bits which I want their imagination to fly, hopefully, with the book as well. So there was a deliberate choice. It's not that I couldn't tie up those threads. I chose not to do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for taking out the time to speak about your novel. It's a pleasure to be launching it at the Lahore Literary Festival. And it's been a pleasure to hear about the multiple layers that exist within the novel in conjunction and how they all interact with each other. Thank you so much.
Do I read another section? Do I read a section?
And I think we could end by having Anita read out another excerpt from the novel.
Okay. So this is, as you all know, that a lot of crimes took place on the trains which were moving between when people realized that partition was taking place, and a lot of incidences happened on the trains, murders and killings. As we said in the videos, this was the largest migration of people in the world. Huge numbers of people were killed. This is my bit on the train journey. So they have gone to visit one of the sisters, and they now are going to get locked. So 3/4 of the journey had passed. Khurshid was asleep, that's the mother, leaning against the train's window. Hamid and Aves, Hamid is Mariam's husband, whose friendship this journey had cemented, hardly spoke a word. Their gaze was drawn again and again to Mariam and the baby. She glanced at Hamid. Aves smiled, thinking it's made her shy. Having settled the baby down, Mariam fell asleep. Hamid too leaned back. Aves turned to look out of the window. The smells, the feel of metal and of earth that change as the seasons change. Nothing was ever static in the world. Even stillness, he thought, was a charade, pretending to be what it never was. He frowned. Another village, Another field. This one looked as if it had never been cultivated. Maybe the soil was acidic and unsuited to growth. But where were the people? Someone had to live here. It was inhospitable, true, but time could change anything. All that was required was a skilled pair of hands. But no, the hands had to know what to do. How long could you survive on luck and the mistake it yields? He saw 2 crows fly down and then swoop almost immediately up. They knew what he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The land was dead. Fragments, harsh, cruel, but when brought together and seen as composite whole, beautiful, not because pain has been transcended. No, there is no golden gate through which we pass into a never-ending circle of light. Why trust the light when we've trusted the dark and believe the shadows we have seen could, if we could only get close enough, be touched? Pain isn't to be transcended, not till the very end, if even then, it's to be born. He taught her she was beautiful, but now the old ideas bubbled up. Maybe her sharp lines were just that, sharp lines. Maybe her aunt had been right. I'll just go on, moving on. So someone begins, the train's been halted. Avers frowned, so the train's been stopped. Avers frowned. Here in this wilderness, which appeared to be without beginning or end, did someone want to get off or come aboard? Soon the complaints began. What are we doing stopping here? I have to get back. I'm going to be late. My son's getting married tomorrow. He can't get married without me. Probably some official wanting to see his aunt. Someone wanting to pee. Look, Avers, said Hamid, pointing out of the window. Avers, look. People were descending from the train in throngs. Maybe there's a problem with the engine, Avers said. Look over there, said Hamid quietly. But before Avers could see what Hamid was pointing to, a young man, a gun gripped tightly in his hand, strode into their carriage. He was scruffily dressed, but his shoes, though old, were immaculately polished. He was hardly 20, thought Avers. He leaned against the barred and paneless window frame and shouted, "Idiot, turn it off." Within minutes, the bell was switched off. He turned back to the passengers, smiling, then shouted, "Get off the train." When no one moved, he cried, "Now." There was a scramble for baggage. "Leave it," he said. The passengers began to make for the doors. He laughed. Avers nudged Miriam. So they're being pulled off to the train. So one of the guys says, "You know what this is," he said. Some of the passengers bent their heads in submission. Like them, Avers had heard about these sorts of attacks, which were becoming daily more frequent. What government there was seemed lame in the face of them. But even if the government had had a better grip on security, what could it have done? The attacks were not coordinated or run by one mastermind. They were random, copycat acts, and therefore, said the police, impossible to control.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly powerful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ji.